Hi there, I'm Chris McFall from UnitedFilm.com. Today I'm going to show you my workflow for creating dynamic triggers in Blender. I'm guessing the first thing I need to address is what the hell are dynamic triggers anyway? Well, dynamic triggers are an element or series of elements within a scene that detects changes within the scene when certain conditions are met, and then they set off or otherwise affect some other element within the scene. Typically, dynamic triggers are used to coordinate large groups of individually animating elements. At its simplest, a cascading effect like a Mexican wave is a relatively simple outcome of a dynamic trigger setup. In this instance, the triggers are pairs of empties connected by code. As you can see, pairs of empties, which are then connected by code that is triggered by Blender's dynamic paint system, which is tied to a displacement modifier, so that when a shape, in this instance this particular shape, passes over those triggers, they set off animating OBJs. What the hell am I talking about? Well, I suppose it's best if I just show you. There you go. This is a floorboard setup, where the planks individually spin in. I know what you're thinking is that this shape isn't touching those triggers, but these are actually set to adjust to the proximity of this shape, so that you get a certain amount of feathering and a smoother playback. It's quite a complicated animation, as you can see, but it doesn't take long. It's relatively quick to set up. Now, in this tutorial, I'm not actually going to show you how to do these floorboards, because there is a better example that I have for a more complicated multi-part animating object, and that is a section of wall, which I'll get to in a minute. Full disclosure, when I set out to create a dynamic trigger system all on my lonesome, I actually, after only a very, very small amount of research, I found Jimmy Gunaway over at Blender Sushi had already figured out exactly what I wanted to do in almost exactly the same way as I had fathomed it. And whilst he hadn't created a tutorial per se, the resources provided were absolutely invaluable to me in creating this workflow. And if you want a better understanding of this process, I really recommend you pay Blender Sushi a visit. Jimmy's site is an incredible source of information, but be warned, he doesn't always serve it all up on a platter for you. When working with Blender Sushi's information, you kind of have to do some legwork, as I discovered in making this process. But in doing that extra work, I think I learnt, and I think you will learn, a hell of a lot more, and really, really cut your teeth in regards to creative problem solving. So, with that in mind, we should probably move forward, and let me show you a little bit of what you can do with dynamic triggers. So here we are in Blender, and this is a file I prepared earlier, which is just an animated section of wall. It's comprised of several simple objects, some animating girders which make up the framework, this grill, which is simply a low poly grill which I've built and then distorted with a lattice so it rolls into position. And the girders just scale into position, and a couple of tiles, panels which just rotate and scale into position, and a final panel on the back just to seal it all in. So this is fairly simple stuff, but combined makes a fairly effective, fairly low poly section of walling, which we're going to use later in the tutorial to repeat throughout the structure which we're going to build and attach dynamic triggers to. So more about that later. For now, what we've got to do is figure out a way to get all these individual components into a single component whilst retaining the animation. Now, this is no small feat, although it seems straightforward enough as something that you should be able to do quite easily, but it actually requires several steps. So we should probably dive right in, because this is going to be a fairly long tutorial as it goes. Right, 25 frames of joy, and what we're going to do is we're going to take those 25 frames and we're going to export it as an OBJ. We're just going to put it in. Also, a quick note whilst we're here is always set a project folder for a new project, and always try to keep it organized as you go. I always start out with the best intentions and then ruin it part way through as things get frantic. So what I've got here is just a project folder. That's our blend file which we're working from currently, and we've got obj seq or obj sequence folder, which is empty currently, and obj mdd folder, which is also empty at the moment, but I've just created those just to simplify organizationally later on. So anyway, let's backtrack a little bit. So we're just going to export an obj, and we're going to export it into the obj sequence folder. And then what we're going to do, just roll these down, is we're going to tick the animation box. That's very, very important, and the include normal box. Also, we're going to change this to Y forward, which will change the up axis to Z, as that corrects a couple of problems that I have later on. And yeah, essentially that should be everything, I think. So let's export this OBJ. Now it'll take a second or two if you've done it correctly. If it goes instantly, then there's a chance that there wasn't very much for it to export, and you've possibly ticked the selection only box, which is not exactly what we wanted to do in this scenario, because it will export an empty OBJ, which is something to be aware of, because there is nothing more frustrating than doing that and not realizing until an hour later. So that's all we want to do in this file. If we start a new file, just get rid of that. I'm going to put on the screencast key so you can see what I'm doing. And there was no need for me to actually delete that box. You could use that box in place of the empty I'm going to use. But here we go, it's an empty, lovely jubbly. What we need to do is actually open a piece of software called Meshfoot, which you can get the Meshfoot script here. And then what we to load the script, you need to create another window and open the text editor, which is what this is, and then we're going to open a text block, and let me show you where have I put it. Blender folder. Here we go, and I keep a little Blender folder with useful scripts in it, and that's where I keep the Meshfoot plugin script. So frame_meshfoot.py, open text block, and as you can see, Meshfoot and its creator, the wonderful Atom there, and this is literally the code which this is the software that we're looking directly at the code for Meshfoot. What we've got to do is just click register and run script. Then we can close that text editor down because we don't need it anymore. And if we click over here to the object menu, fold some of these down so we can see what we're doing, you'll notice that it has added a little section called Meshfoot. Now, when we click this button, you'll see the name appears next to the empty, and it's now renamed it Meshfoot_empty, meaning it is now an active Meshfoot object. Also, it's given us a plethora of different options. So I'm just going to fold down Blender too, because for this bit it'll be a little bit easier if we can see the folder which we're working in. Oh dear. Damn you, Windows 7. And also we'll want to bring out the system console. Now if you're on the Mac, you can go here to look for instructions on how to open your system console. In Windows, you literally just go to Window, toggle System Console. It's not absolutely essential to have that open, but it does give you a little bit of useful information, particularly when you're using Meshfoot, which can be a little bit tricky. It's a wonderful piece of software, but not necessarily super user-friendly. What we're going to do is opening the folder where we saved our OBJ sequence, and we're going to copy the path of that folder, and we're going to put it in the path field here. Copy and paste, there we go, Control V. Then we're going to take the name of any one of these files, and we're going to paste that without the extension, the extension being the dot and everything afterwards. We're going to paste that into the name field here. Now you're going to notice a couple of things about the OBJ sequence. For every frame it has created two files, an MTL file, which we can forget about for now, and the OBJ files. Now it's a 25 frame animation, and it has made 25 files, OBJ files, so one for each frame. Now each frame is numbered, and that's what the end of the file name is comprised of. Unfortunately, it creates a little bit too much padding for us. Being only 25 frames long, there are only 2 digits in that number sequence that changes. The other 4 zeros of padding are obsolete. So the reason this is a problem is Meshfoot requires you to give the name and then however many padded numbers it wants hashes or pound signs in the frame pattern field to tell you how many of these padded zeros go in. 4 of these padded zeros don't count as padded zeros because they do not change during the number sequence. So we're going to leave that there and then just delete the last 2 digits which do actually change throughout the number sequence. And then we're going to leave 2 hashes or pound signs in the frame pattern box. If you don't do that correctly, you're going to get problems, and it probably won't link to the files right. It can be really finicky about that sort of thing. So just make sure you, if you've got a problem, play around with that, and you should be able to figure it out there. The other thing we need to do is tell it where the sequence starts. It starts on frame number 1, and it finishes on frame 25. So start and end, all pretty much self-explanatory. And then we're going to click Preload OBJ Sequence. You can see it working away here. Smashing. So it's done its magic, but we can't see anything in the viewport here which has changed, and we can't see anything has changed in the I forget what this thing's called. The reason for this is we need to. I do not understand why, but you have to drag the playhead, and suddenly you'll see we've got this Meshfoot object has appeared underneath the original Meshfoot controller, and as you can see, our wall section has started to animate. So that's fantastic. That's exactly what we wanted to do. It's a good place to save this. So save as, and we'll save it as Meshfoot wall. Lovely jubbly. Okay, save that. So now we've got a null that thinks it's an animated section of wall, all in a single object. Very neat. However, the Meshfoot plugin isn't, as we've discovered, isn't the most user-friendly method of doing things, and I doubt it would stand up to many multiple items being brought in this method. So what we're going to actually do is something that Atom, the author of Meshfoot, actually explores in a wonderful tutorial that you can find here, is that we're now going to take this and export it as an MDD file. Now, if you haven't got the option to export an MDD in your export menu, then what you need to do is go to User Preferences, Add-ons, and type in the search bar MDD, and you'll find Import Export NewTek MDD Format. Tick that box, and you're good to go. As you can see, there it is, Lightwave Point Cache.mdd. If you go into the OBJ MDD folder, and what we want is, for me, 24 frames a second is perfect. You've got start frame you'd think would be 1, but I guarantee you there will be problems if you start at 1, because for some reason it doesn't, because it's so totally empty, it'll the MDD modifier will misinterpret that and make some interesting compensation for it. So we're just going to start at start frame 2 and make sure our end frame is 25. Export MDD, lovely jubbly, Bob's your auntie, and there we are. So now what? Well, now I would recommend selecting everything by pressing A and pressing M to move it to a different layer, and then just selecting the layer beneath. Then what we're going to do is we are going to import OBJ, and we're going to choose the last OBJ in the sequence So it'll still be a static OBJ, it's just the last one of a sequence, it won't be an animating one. And very important, if you're on split, that's what you're probably seeing. If you see that, then what you want to do is just select keep vert order and make sure that Y forward and Z up are selected, and you should be good to go. Import OBJ, and again, so that's our mesh foot one, which is a virtual version of this wall, and then here is an actual solid singular object. But unfortunately static object that we are now going to apply an MDD mesh cache, I can't even say it, mesh cache to. If you add the mesh cache modifier, go to file path, go to the mesh cache that we've just made, the MDD file we've just made, accept, and then click factor and custom, and you'll see evaluation factor. This is how we're going to control our object. Ta-da! There you go. So what we're actually going to do in the long run is we're going to use a script I've written to add a driver into this evaluation factor, which will power this animation. And it's going to do that for many, many dozens of instances of this wall section. So now's as good a time to save it as any. Save as mesh foot wall, and I think we're going to say MDD cache wall. Save, and then we're going to start looking at using triggers. Okay. Okay, now we've created our wall section and suitably set up the MDD cache and whatnot, I'm just going to, in the interest of being very organized, keeping everything, keeping not only organizing it, but allowing us to expand this project a little bit further and also make these assets reusable, I think it's probably a good idea to stick everything we've got, bar the script, bar this script that you can see here. We'll move all of that into the wall folder, as that is everything that is to do with the wall segment. Next thing to do is we're going to move on to a brand new Blender file where as you can see, I've already imported an SVG. That's done through import scalable vector graphics, and this is an architectural plan I was given to work from of a classroom, and essentially all we're doing is we're going to use this plan to build our 3D model around. SVG scalable vector graphics are, they're very much like Illustrator AI files or EPS files. They're just vector drawings, illustrations which you can import into Blender to use as a guideline. So obviously you'll have to have some architectural plans to work from, but you could just as easily work from a sketch or a scribble of what you wanted things to work from, or you could work without a plan. I just find it's easier to have it laid out and know where you're working from. Okay, well, with that done, what I'm going to do is make sure that I cannot interact with this plan. Actually, let's do something else first. Let's move the plan to a different layer, and then let's make sure that we cannot select it, and then let's make sure that layer is turned on so we can see it. And I think what we're going to do is start bringing in sections of wall. So let's, just as we did before, import wavefront obj, obj sequence, just pick the last one, import. I probably should have I should have checked what I was doing there. I think I'm beginning to get a cold coming on, so my brains are escaping out my nostrils. Forward Y and up Z, and keep vert order. So just do that, and there we go. It's the right way up, and everything is hunky-dory. So press 7 and 5. Oh, do you know what? I should probably make these screencast keys visible. There we go. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to be using any dynamic ways of laying stuff out in this tutorial. If you want to find more out about dynamic methods of laying out objects, then you can go to Blender Sushi here. They have plenty of suggestions for using dupliverts, using particle systems, and all sorts of other crazy ways of laying your stuff out. I'm going to press R, Z90, and that has rotated it for us. Unfortunately, the grill is on the wrong side here, so I'm going to press RZ180. And now the grill is facing inwards. That way we get more detailed wall faces on this side. Now, if I was doing a proper ArchViz video right here, I'd probably be more inclined to being quite precise. As it is, I'm just going to drag stuff out. And oh, actually, you know, I am going to be quite sloppy in this tutorial, just to expedite things. But if I press Alt-D, that creates an instant duplicate, a duplicated instance, I should say. And then we're going to move it along the green. Let's tell you what. Do that one more time. We're going to be duplicating along the y-axis, yeah. So we're just going to select that, press Alt-D to create a new instance, and then we're going to press Y and then 2.95, enter. And what that's done is created a duplicate, an instance of this panel, 2.95 Blender units across the Y axis. And then I can press Shift R and that duplicates it again, which is great. Unfortunately, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. First I'll just Shift D and select them all, Shift D and drag them across to create another section of wall for this side, and then again we're going to press RZ180 and that's turned them to face inwards. Again with this we're going to need to press Alt-D and Y 2.95. Okay. Yeah, this section of wall is falling short by a little bit. Now, normally what I'd probably do to be more precise is I'd create smaller sections about half the size of this so that we can sort of jam it together, and then I'd fudge it a little bit with the scale, but as it is, scale, so S, Y, and then just going to pull it out, just like that. S, Y, and yeah, just to get the walls to the right sort of size. As I said, yeah, in this particular tutorial, precision's not really something I'm overly concerned with. So we're just going to fly through as quick as we can. In fact, I'm probably going to speed up the rest of this sequence just so it doesn't bore you out of your little minds. Okay, as I just mentioned, really what I should be doing is adding in floors, doors, windows and furnishings right now, and actually finishing the static build before I get on to adding dynamic trigger elements. However, I really want to get to the point of this tutorial, and it's gone on quite long enough, so I'm going to cut to the chase with this and just show you how to add the dynamic triggering. Then I'll come back, finish this project and show you the end result. So first things first, let's get these cameras and lights off the layer. So it's M and then just click on the layer appropriate. We want to deselect this layer So just have the first default layer selected, and then what we've got to do before we start using the script, which I've written for this tutorial, what we want to do is just add a mesh cache modifier. Adding a mesh cache modifier, go in and add the path to the wall, object mdd, meshfoot_wall.mdd, just as before, and you'll notice your object has now disappeared. Click Factor and Custom, and all it's done is it's on the first frame of the animation, and in the first frame of the animation it's invisible. So scaling through to the evaluation factor to 1, and everything is hunky-dory and as it should be again. Right, what we're going to do is we are going to, leaving that on 1, we'll press A to select all, then hold down Shift, right click again. So now this one object, the one object with the mesh cache modifier is the last thing that we've selected, and then what we're going to do is press Shift, Control, sorry, and C, and then and actually I should probably explain before we go ahead with that. If when you press Control C, you don't see this copy attributes menu, it's because you probably haven't enabled it. So you have to go into User Preferences, Add-ons, type in Copy, and you just want to make sure Copy Attributes menu here is ticked. If you don't have that, I'm not sure if it's available in, I believe it's in Trunk, but if it isn't, I will provide a link for you. So there's a link there to your Copy Attributes menu download, and then you can install that script. And yeah, it's incredibly useful. I highly recommend it. So Control C, and it brings up your Copy Attributes menu, and then we can just go Copy Modifiers. And what it's done is, because this was the last one selected, it's copied the modifiers of the last selected object to all other selected objects. And now you'll find that they all have the same modifier with the same attributes as this one. So obviously that won't work if you're trying to copy it to different objects which require different MDD caches, because, excuse me, those caches, it's copying the cache path data as well. Just something to bear in mind. You'd have to do those all separately. So right, now we've got that done, then we've got to do, just pull open a new window, go to the text editor, text, open a text block, then in my, actually, normally I'd keep it in my Blender folder with my scripts, but for the purpose of this tutorial I've kept trigger underscore setup underscore panel.py. This is the trigger script which I wrote for this tutorial, which is available here. If you make sure that you've got that to hand, and all we're going to do is we're going to open that text block up, and it will show you a big wodge of badly written code. I say it's badly written because I wrote it, so I know it's badly written. And if we scroll along the menu, to scroll along the menu, by the way, it's just the mouse wheel, hold down the mouse wheel, and you can, if your window's not big enough, you can do that. Tick the register box, and we're going to run script. And for some reason now, it tells me that there's an error, but I know it's fine. I cannot remember why it does that. I will fix it in a later version. This the coding of this add-on is an ongoing thing, and obviously I just wanted to get it out there in public domain whilst I had it, and hopefully that will aid its development somewhat. Anyway, you will now see in the tool section, after running that script, it has brought up United Films Dynamic Trigger Setup. A ridiculous title by any stretch of the imagination, but then, you know, I'm a fairly ridiculous person. So what we're going to do is press A twice, and that will deselect everything, then select it all again. So we've got all our objects selected, and what this is going to do is, this field is a name that is going to rename each object and then give it an integer, I can't say it. We're going to call that wall underscore, and then just obj. So this one will be wall1, this wall underscore obj1, wall underscore obj2 and so on and so forth. Then it's going to create a static null for each, an empty, not a null, and we'll call that wall as well, wall underscore static null, and it will create one of these empties at the origin point of each of these objects and number it according to the object it corresponds to, and then it will do the same with another empty which it will call a trigger null. Now, what's the point of all this? Essentially, for each object we now have a mesh cache modifier with an evaluation factor which we need to manipulate. So what this code does, it creates these two objects, these two empties that correspond to each of these objects, and then it creates a driver in the evaluation factor here that says that the value is equal to the distance between these two, the two corresponding empties for this object. Then what we're going to do is we're going to add, using Lero's script, we're going to add a dynamic paint canvas layer, which is going to attach to the trigger nulls, and a brush for the dynamic canvas, and as that brush moves over the canvas, it will displace the canvas, moving the trigger nulls apart from the static nulls, and that will then drive this value and therefore animate each of these objects as the brush passes over it. So, without any further ado, select all, go gadget setup. Everything's disappeared. Oh my god, we've broken it. No, we haven't, don't worry. Obviously everything is now on its first frame and therefore is invisible. So if we go to the second layer here, these are all the static nulls, and on the third layer, these are all the trigger nulls. So I'm going to try and keep moving fast because it's a very long tutorial. Just saved it. I'm going to open another window, text editor. As I mentioned earlier, you are going to need Lero's scripts. Lero's scripts are available here. I've already got them downloaded into my Blender folder, so I'm going to go to Scripts Blender folder, and I'm looking for mesh, parent mesh add-on. Open text block. Great. Again, we're just going to scroll over here, run script. Oh, should have registered, run script. And it brings up these options. I don't know where my brain went for a second there. So what it gives you some options: scale, orienting, faces, and single vertex. So we're going to ignore all of those for now. We're just going to go parent to mesh. Now what it's done is it's created a triangle of mesh for each and every one of these empties, and it has hooked it to that empty, which means that when that moves, when these vertices move, so will our empties, which is exactly what we want. Now it's named that that mesh because this is all a single mesh. Even though it's all broken up, it's named this single mesh Padre, Spanish for father, I believe. So it's the parent layer, which is exactly what we want. What we're going to do then is we're going to add in a modifier. It'll be displace, and then we're going to add in dynamic paint, canvas, add canvas. Before I go on, very important, go back to the modifiers and then just push the down arrow on displace so that dynamic paint is first. Otherwise, this won't work. Okay, Shift A, add a cube. This cube we're going to rename here brush. After renaming it, let's go to the object options or menu, if you like, and go all the way down to display, maximum draw type, and choose wire. Now we can see through it no matter what, because we don't want this to show up in our scene, and you know, all it is just a reference point so we can see what's going on. I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to choose plane select and pull these two side faces, face select, pull these side faces out so it's a little bit wider, and then I'm going to and this is very important. When you're setting up dynamic paint, you won't instantly see changes, and that causes a lot of problems because you can bypass the ideal settings without ever realizing that you'd actually hit them. So what I tend to do is I drop this down to the end of the animation down to 50, so it's not a particularly long animation, and then I will set a starting location for our object by going over here. If you don't see this sidebar, just press N or click the little button there. But I'm going to go to the location settings for my brush, and I'm going to press I whilst the mouse hovers over it. That has set a keyframe here in our frame 1, and then I'm going to scroll to frame 50, and I'm going to take our brush, move it all the way through our trigonals, and then again press I, and we've set a second keyframe. So now if I press play, it will loop through these. Okay, and we know that we are getting close when we see the trigonals and the Padre layer displacing and moving away from the static nulls. Okay, I don't know how clear that was. I do apologise, it's quite a lot of information to impart, so I'm going to do my best, but I mean, make sure you questions in the comments fields, I guess. So what I'm going to do is get Padre layer selected. We're going to scroll down, and we're going to change a couple of options. Dynamic Paint Advanced, we're going to change that to weight. This is now painting weight values rather than colour values and so on. Then in Dynamic Paint Output, we want it to output to a vertex group called, well, the default is Dynamic Paint _ weight. So press the plus, and that has now made that vertex group exist for us, which means we can access it using our Displace modifier. The Displace modifier will now be affecting the DP weight layer, which is great. That's exactly what we wanted. I'm going to change the direction to Z, so it only moves up and down rather than all over the place. As you can see, these have instantly, I thought they had moved, but I don't know if that was my imagination. What we're going to do is go to the texture, create a texture, then go to this texture, and this is the texture that we're displacing with. We don't want it noisy, we just want a single colour. That single colour is probably, if we go to the blend setting, I guess we could just delete part of the ramp. I don't want to delete the first one, let's delete that one. So yeah, we'll be painting in black. And yeah, sorry, the layer we're painting on will be black, and then what we want is, oh, I'm breaking stuff. We want the brush and catching it as it moves. Oh yeah, we haven't set the brush up yet, so have I actually got the brush set? Yeah, that's good. We'll click on the dynamic paint settings for the brush, choose brush and add brush. And as you can see, this is now, it's smacking those things down as it runs through them, which is great. That's pretty much what we want. We're going to change this to white, just so that we know that the values are as pure as possible. And we'll change this to mesh volume and proximity. This way we can add a little bit of feathering. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select, including these two layers, I'm going to hold down Shift and then just select the first layer. And as you can see, it just sort of barrels through and it looks a bit crap. So what we're going to do is we'll select the brush again, and going into the dynamic paint settings, we are going to affect the paint distance on, because we've already changed it to mesh volume plus proximity. So if we change the proximity to being larger, then you'll see we get a much more gradual transition. Now I know what you're thinking, it still looks crap. What's wrong with it? It's not, they're not unfurling to their entirety. And there's lots and lots of things which can affect that. So I'm just going to select the Padre layer again, and then within the modifier, I'm just going to bump up the strength a little bit. And I think around 2 A strength of 2 should sort that out. There's plenty of ways you could have fiddled with that to change it, but you know, that for me was the easiest. And you can see it's actually looking pretty good now. What we're going to do is go back to frame 1, and unfortunately everything's already activating, so we're just going to pull it all the way back, and then we're going to go to location, press I, and now when we press play, it all starts to grow and looks pretty organic. So there we go, a dynamic trigger setup for walls. I think that looks really, really cool. I hope you think it looks cool. I hope you like it. I hope it's useful to you. This doesn't need to just be used on architectural visualizations either. I mean, it can be used for all sorts of simulations and organic stuff, and yeah, I mean, the sky really is the limit with this. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go away. I'm going to make the floors and the furniture, and I'm going to set these into dynamic trigger arrays and set them up to trigger, set up a couple of cameras and render it out so you can see just how cool this really is. Okay, a quick note about my approach in this particular tutorial. I'm well aware that, particularly with the floorboard animation that I showed at the beginning of this tutorial, that that using a mesh cache and going through that whole process of creating the mesh cache and triggering it in this manner is not the best way to go about doing an animation like this, in the sense that each of these floorboards is actually only being manipulated in its local location, rotation and scale elements, which it would have been a fairly simple thing to modify the code, the script which I've written for the dynamic trigger setup. It would have been a fairly simple thing to change the code to add drivers here rather than adding a driver here. And that probably would have been a more versatile, more efficient solution. However, the reason I haven't shown that in this tutorial, the reason I went with the mesh cache setup, is because the mesh cache was capable of handling complex OBJs and basically anything you throw at it, whereas the location, rotation and scale, it's a very simplistic, it is very limited. It's not simplistic necessarily, but it is limited in what it can do. And I didn't want to do a tutorial showing you half a dozen different ways and really confuse the issue. So I hope that's cleared that up, and I hope that it's that this is useful to you. But what I would, I'd love for people to take this code on themselves and to manipulate it and change it, and maybe do a scale, location, rotation version where you can change and modify the values on the panel. That's something which I'm looking at doing, but I probably, knowing me, I might never get around to it. I'm going to set up, so you can comment back and give me feedback through either my website, my email, or through the Blender Artists page here. And if you do use my code to create anything, I'd love to see what you do. And if you change it and modify it to create, well, just to improve it, or you have suggestions on how to, then I'd love to hear from you. I hope that this tutorial has been useful to you. I hope that you think that it's as great as the technique is as great as I think it is. I think it's a wonderfully versatile, wonderfully powerful tool, and I certainly hope you can see the benefits in that. And yeah, I really hope to see what you guys can do with this tool. And yeah,